If you're confused by the Armani suit title, another way to kind of characterize what I'm going to talk about is this phrase that I've been using for the last year and a half, the rise of what I call the biomedical security state. And Governor DeSantis, I don't know if he's been reading my Substack or not, recently said that we can either have a free society or we can live in a biomedical security state. So what is the biomedical security state, and why is it important for us to understand it? And my story begins a little over a year ago, and really kind of heated up 6 months ago, when I had published a piece in the Wall Street Journal challenging the ethics of vaccine mandates at the University of California, Irvine, where I was a professor in the School of Medicine for my entire career, 15 years, and where I also directed the medical ethics program. The university then promulgated their vaccine mandate policy without consulting any of the ethicists like me who had drafted all of the other pandemic policies at the university. And if you want things to go sideways with your employer, one good way to affect that is to sue them in federal court, which is actually what I did. So I filed a lawsuit on 14th Amendment equal protection grounds in federal court. It's still in the appellate court, challenging the vaccine mandate on behalf of people like me who had natural immunity after recovering from COVID. And the university moved very swiftly to put me on investigatory leave, then a month later on unpaid suspension, then a month later they fired me for alleged non-compliance with this mandate that I was challenging in federal court. So I wanted to understand what happened with vaccine mandates. I wanted to understand what happened with lockdowns and other COVID measures that I felt were excessively authoritarian and that we now know were largely ineffective from a public health standpoint. And what I realized is you have to understand these things and where they came from in a broader context. And most of us probably don't want to talk about COVID anymore. I really don't want to talk about COVID anymore. It sort of seems like that's been sundown, sort of over that. Yeah, there's still cases, there's still people getting hospitalized. But you know, we don't have to wear masks and we don't have to socially distance, and we can hang out together now. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that this infrastructure that was put in place during the pandemic is not going away. It's with us, and it will be redeployed, I think, in the very near future for other purposes. So we're going to talk about 6 key features of the biomedical security state. In my forthcoming book, there's a 7th feature that I discuss, but in the interest of time, we're going to talk about the first 6. So the biomedical security state begins with the militarization of public health. It's a melding of 3 things: public health with the police powers of the state and digital technologies of surveillance and control. And within this framework, real known present human goods, like burying the dead or worshiping God, are sacrificed on the altar of future biological risks that are entirely theoretical. From the lepers of the Old Testament to the plague of Justinian in ancient Rome to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, COVID represented the first time in human history that we had confined healthy populations. Lots of folks called the lockdowns a quarantine and said, you know, people in the ancient medieval world did this. No. Medieval quarantines sometimes involved locking the gates of a walled city or closing borders, but they never involved refusing to allow people to ply their trades or to interact with one another within those quarantined areas. And they certainly never involved attempts to isolate entirely asymptomatic persons. Lockdowns were entirely novel. The word lockdown doesn't come from traditional public health. It comes from the penal system, right? A prison goes into lockdown when the prisoners are rioting. So the most tightly controlled, highly surveilled environment in the world goes into lockdown when chaos erupts in order to reassert total control. We now have overwhelming evidence that the lockdowns failed to stop the spread of COVID. The lockdowns, the social distancing, the mask mandates, the mass vaccination campaign, at least 80% of Americans have had COVID, have been infected with the virus. We now routinely hear of pandemic countermeasures. When I first heard this term, I was confused because it's not a term you ever hear in the hospital. Virologists and physicians never talk about viral countermeasures. This is a term of spycraft and soldiering. It's a term invented by CIA spooks. A little timeline to understand some of the things that were happening during the pandemic that most Americans are not aware of. November 2021, the Israeli government passed emergency pandemic legislation permitting the Shin Bet, their equivalent of the CIA, to access mobile phone data and extract, track, and trace data from suspected, not suspected domestic terrorists, but suspected COVID cases. So Israel's version of the CIA was spying on their own citizens. December 2021, Canada's Public Health Agency confirmed that it had been extracting mobile track and trace data from the outset of the pandemic to covertly track citizens' movements during lockdowns. The agency plans on expanding this program on into 2026 and deploying it for other public health purposes. In May of this year, Vice broke the story that, quoting the headline, the CDC tracked millions of phones to see if Americans followed COVID lockdown orders. The CDC used phone location data to monitor, for example, the movement of people at schools and churches. The CIA also admitted that it plans to expand this program and use it for other applications beyond COVID in the future. Evidence also emerged this year that the CIA has been using unauthorized digital surveillance to spy on Americans. Two members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, both Democrats, warned in a letter that, quote, recently revealed documents show serious problems associated with warrantless backdoor searches of Americans. So spy agencies not spying on people for suspected terrorist activity, but spying on people for public health purposes. These developments actually go back 20 years. For the last 20 years, very high-level intelligence, military, public health, political, and industry leaders have been gathering every couple of years and running tabletop pandemic war game scenarios, right? With names that come straight out of central casting. Back in 2001, we had Dark Winter. 2003, we had this simulation called Atlantic Storm and Global Mercury. 2010 gave us a simulation called Lockstep. Many of you heard about Event 201, sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the World Economic Forum. This was a tabletop simulation just 2 months before the first reported case of COVID. And it was a simulation involving a global pandemic of a novel coronavirus. It's enough to make anyone a paranoid conspiracy theorist. But you could find this online. I recommend that you go online and watch like the 12-minute highlight version on YouTube of Event 201. You can watch the full simulation, but it's remarkable. And many of the people around the table, very quickly, a month or two later, moved into actual positions of leadership in terms of our pandemic management. All of these simulations involve, well, they all end with coerced mass vaccination, but they all involve kind of a lesson to be learned is more stringent and more authoritarian and more total control is necessary if we're going to manage a global pandemic. Second feature, the biomedical security state dictates that various problems that were previously understood to be social or environmental or economic problems be reframed as public health issues and eventually declared a public health emergency. The new model of governance associated with this entails jumping from one declared emergency to the next, each time invoking the need for extra legislative or extra judicial powers, executive powers, to deal with the declared emergency. Anyone want a side of monkeypox with your COVID burger, right? Some of you may recall during the BLM protests in 2020, during lockdowns, that thousands of public health experts rushed to sign a statement declaring racism as a public health emergency. So the state of emergency for COVID supposedly required locking down, but an additional state of emergency for racism permitted these mass gatherings and protests to deal with its kind of some intersectional hierarchy of public health issues. And when an issue like racism is reframed as a public health issue, notice what happens. right? It ceases to become a crisis of democracy, as in the 1965 Voter Rights Act, or a crisis of religion and morality, as we see, for example, in Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And it becomes a public health crisis to be dealt with by public health experts, right? So authority to address a problem like this is taken from ordinary citizens or ordinary civic institutions and transferred to scientific ones. Listen to the experts. We'll tell you how to solve this. Climate change was redefined as a public health issue even prior to the pandemic, and then proposals late in the pandemic to reframe it as a public health crisis have been surfacing. You're starting to see headlines like this. Pay attention to the headlines and the framing of climate change in the newspapers these days. It's more and more framed as a public health issue and more framed as a public health crisis. So the proposal of rolling lockdowns to deal with climate change has been floated by very serious and very influential people. President Biden has even mentioned it as a possibility recently. So what I want to suggest is that in early 2020, February and March of 2020, with lockdowns, we lived through the implementation not just of a novel approach to public health or pandemic management. We lived through the implementation of a novel political paradigm, a new strategy for controlling populations in ways previously unimaginable in Western nations. As the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben put it, under lockdowns and social distancing, the total cessation of every form of political and social activity became the ultimate act of civic participation, which is a weird contradiction, right? We serve society by being antisocial. Even now, for many citizens, it seems not to matter that these impositions failed to deliver the promised public health outcomes. It actually did tremendous collateral damage, especially the school closures. All of this has also been preceded by legal developments over the last 20 to 30 years. So in the UK, for example, their Public Health Act of 1875 was amended back in 1984 to allow authorities to quarantine citizens for unlimited durations without needing to prove that those quarantined were infected or contagious. In the US, following the 9/11 attacks, state governors can declare a state of emergency at will, with resistance from citizens constituting a felony. Which brings us to the third feature. The biomedical security state assumes the legal form of existing in a state of exception or a state of emergency, where hypothetical risks, according to a kind of worst-case logic, are used to justify very extreme responses and systematic control of the entire body of citizens, of the entire population. The purported protection of public health then overrules any individual or privacy rights. Health is imposed on citizens as a legal obligation, rather than access to health care being a right. It's a legal obligation. This is precisely the pandemic strategy that we saw in 2020. Lockdowns were formulated on the basis of now discredited worst case scenario modeling from the Imperial College London. This failed model overpredicted 2.2 million immediate deaths in the United States in 2020 if we didn't lock down. And consequently, the entire body of citizens, as a kind of manifestation of civic spirit, gave up freedoms and rights that had not been relinquished by Western nations ever. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Now, whenever you make a Nazi analogy, people freak out. So let me just caveat here. I'm not comparing either the current or the previous administration to Hitler's regime, but it remains an undeniable historical fact that the Nazis governed for virtually the entirety of their existence under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which permitted, what? The suspension of German laws during times of emergency. So, people forget Hitler was democratically elected. How did he go from the democratically elected chancellor to the absolute dictatorial authority in a totalitarian system? Well, this state of exception, the state of emergency doctrine that was deployed legally was a key fulcrum or mechanism to allow that takeover of power. In the new biomedical security state, the real sovereign, the locus of political authority, resides with the person who's allowed to declare a state of emergency. At the federal level, that person is the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. Anyone know who currently occupies that role? Yeah, a man named Javier Becerra, right? Those of us who reside in California remember him as our former Attorney General. So this is a man with no medical training and no previous public health experience, and with the support of the president, every 3 months since February of 2020, he has renewed the national state of emergency for COVID. When it was renewed back in February, President Biden's letter explaining why we were supposedly still in a state of national emergency, the only COVID statistic cited in this letter was the total number of COVID deaths in the United States over the entire pandemic, which is a number that increases every month, even when the death rate has gone down very significantly. So basically, in the law deliberately never defined a threshold for what constitutes a public health emergency. And there are currently no legislative or judicial checks on the declared state of emergency. So when the executive, whether it's the president and the HHS secretary or state governor, declares a state of emergency, they assume extra constitutional powers. The president assumes 128 new powers during a state of emergency. So you see this as a way of arrogating power, and as we know, people that accrue power are reluctant to give it back. And if the courts or the legislature can't act to declare the state of emergency over, and there's no threshold definition that could tell us when the state of emergency, how many cases, how many hospitalizations, is the healthcare system being overwhelmed, what have you, then that can continue and has continued indefinitely. Since World War II, actually, the state of exception is no longer exceptional. Even in democratic Western nations, declared states of emergency have frequently become the norm. They've continued in some countries for decades, including ours. Back in 1978, approximately 30 countries were operating under a state of emergency. By 1986, this rose to 70 countries, and during COVID, 124 countries were operating under a state of emergency, with many more having states of emergency in particular provinces or regions. As of February of 2020, there were 32 active national emergencies in the United States that still had not been sundowned. The oldest is 39 years old, and these have been renewed by presidential administrations from both parties year after year. The biomedical security state doesn't just involve political maneuvering and legal mechanisms. It also involves industry and the corporate world very implicates the corporate world and engages the corporate world very deeply. The biomedical security state tends to drive the various industries towards systems of algorithmically controlled automation, where humans operating in these systems are reduced to what you might call a kind of bare biological life, right? So our human resources are basically a collection of muscles and tendons and ligaments and bones that have regrettable excretion and energy requirements that sort of get in the way of the efficient functioning of these systems. In my book, I use Amazon fulfillment warehouses and the systems currently operating there as a kind of paradigm example of this trend. But I'm not to pick on Amazon, this is being held up as a model for many different industries. For now, I think, just in reflecting on what happened to us during the pandemic, consider the human goods that we sacrificed to bare biological life. Friendships, holidays with family, work, visiting the sick and dying, providing the sacraments to the sick and dying, worshiping God, burying the dead. And by burying the dead, I mean not just funerals, but actually burying the dead. One of the worst moments in the pandemic came when I was still at UCI Hospital. I was chairing the ethics committee. We had an ethics consult for a man who was irretrievably dying of COVID. He wasn't going to make it out of the hospital. And we had a long and very painful conversation with the family, trying to help them accept that even with aggressive interventions, your father, your brother is not going to make it. And they finally came to accept that, which was difficult. And then they turned to the social worker and asked, can we get help with funeral arrangements? They were from Mexico, Spanish-speaking only. They didn't have resources. They wanted some assistance. Usually we assist those folks with some help with the funeral. And the social worker turned to them and told them that they would not be allowed to bury their loved one, that he would be cremated by the hospital and the ashes returned to them. And they said, well, no, he was Catholic and he would want a traditional sort of Christian burial. Why was the CDC recommending this early in the pandemic? A theoretical future biological risk that a corpse could somehow spread COVID which was a completely absurd notion that had zero basis. Never is it known in the history of mankind that any respiratory infection could be spread by a corpse. And yet that theoretical biological risk overrode a real present human, familial, religious good in this case. And it was just astonishing to see this. I was completely horrified. During the pandemic, we lived through the swift and sustained abolition of all public spaces. And we squeezed even private spaces of encounter. Ordinary human contact was redefined as contagion. You remember when governors and the president were discouraging even Thanksgiving family gatherings with more than, 2, 3 people. There are coming developments here that would require another lecture to really drill down into, but I'll mention them briefly because I think they're things that we should be aware of and things that we should oppose when they're publicly proposed. The first is there's a big global push for digital IDs that are tied to biometric data, retinal scans, facial IDs, fingerprints. This company Clear that you might have seen at some of the airports, right? You give away this biometric data, and then you go to the front of the security line, right? And they're packaging this up and selling this data to third parties. Digital IDs will be tied to central bank digital currencies, right? The feds are talking about a digital dollar. China has already issued a digital yuan. These are, unlike Bitcoin, which is a sort of decentralized digital currencies, a central bank digital currency will allow the government to track each and every one of your financial transactions, right? And not only that, these are not actually currencies. They're more like temporary vouchers. So the federal government could give you a tax refund, but have certain strings attached, right? You have to spend it on green energy, or you have to spend it on one of these 10 things, or you're not allowed to spend it on going to the Napa Institute because those people are mean and bad, or whatever. And it could expire in 9 months, right, if you don't spend it. So it's not actually a real currency. We will be giving up, moving from a cash society to a cashless society where the currency is really under the control of central banks and affiliated government officials. And once that is tied to this digital ID system, which doesn't even necessarily require an app on your phone, it's just a retinal scan or a facial ID check, that all of these things will be trackable, right? So a year or two from now, you get a notification on your phone. Father Scott, your carbon footprint is 23% above other cis, white, heterosexual males similarly situated in the greater Portland area, right? And we're going to tax you an additional 90 cents on gas unless you convert over to an electric-only vehicle, right? And so it's like, wow, okay, that hurts. And 6 months later, you still haven't converted over, they'll double that tax. And 6 months after that, if you still haven't gotten on board with what they want you to do or what they want you to buy, the algorithm, or maybe a real person, will push a button and you simply won't be able to buy gas anymore, right? When all the transactions have gone digital. So, digital IDs, central bank digital currencies, they're going to try to sell it to you as convenience, as if you lose your wallet, it's not going to be a problem, all kinds of selling points, but I think we have to be very wary. The fifth feature, the philosophical underpinnings of the biomedical security state. I'm not, again, this would take another lecture to unpack, so just very briefly, I want to mention the new ethics that's associated with this. We heard about utilitarian ethics this morning from Carl Trueman. That's one way of understanding this. Ethics of the direction of history that's sort of discerned by an elite clerisy. This is the direction that we're moving, and if you're not on board with that, you're simply a bad person. You're going to be steamrolled. This new ethics has no space for traditional medical ethics. So I staked my career on the principle of informed consent, which was enshrined in the Nuremberg Code, in the Helsinki Declaration of the World Medical Association, in the Belmont Report commissioned by our own federal government back in the 1970s that formed the basis for federal law governing human subjects research in the United States. This is a central feature of 20th century medical ethics. The laws allowing for the state of exception, state of emergency, tossed all that overboard. And we got vaccine mandates. Am I anti-vaccine? No, I'm anti-vaccine mandates for competent adults that should make their own decisions for themselves and for their children when it comes to healthcare and when it comes to things that are injected into their body. Another principle, ethical principle of public health, transparency, was also sacrificed during the pandemic by this regime. Along with several colleagues, I filed a Freedom of Information Act to the FDA to get the clinical trials data that was submitted by Pfizer for FDA authorization of their vaccine. And under federal law, the very day that it's authorized, that data was supposed to have been made public. The FDA was not making it public. We filed this request. The Department of Justice lawyers for the FDA came back and said, we'll give you 500 pages a month, which if you did the math would have taken 75 years to get the data that they reviewed in less than 3 months. We had a good judge. Judge said, no, you have 9 months to release this data. Pfizer then intervened, asking to redact the data before it was released, which was not surprising. What was surprising is that the DOJ lawyers representing the FDA agreed with Pfizer and asked the judge, can we have the corporation redact the data before it's released to the public? Judge said no. The initial documents released show very concerning adverse effects from the vaccines in the first 3 months after vaccine rollout that the company knew about, that went unreported, that were not part of the informed consent process for people who were getting the vaccine either voluntarily or under duress because of mandates. Thousands of people like me have lost our jobs for declining a novel injection whose safety and efficacy data still remains to this day hidden from public scrutiny and independent analysis. The biomedical security state takes the political form of corporatism, which involves the melding of state and corporate power, state and corporate interests. Very few Americans realize, for example, that the NIH co-owns the patent on the Moderna vaccine and makes money from it. And Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees NIH, CDC, FDA, approved that vaccine, authorized it, that was the job of the FDA, recommended it, that was the job of the CDC. On the basis of that recommendation, public and private institutions mandated it. So taxpayer money funded the development of this product for this company, funded the research, it funded the authorization, it funded the approval, it funded the recommendation. The company is indemnified against all liability for any harms that are done. So if you're harmed by the vaccine, you have no recourse. The government created a market for the product through mandates. And so there's this sort of closed circle between industry and the government. And the vaccines became a $100 billion industry. Why didn't the CDC acknowledge natural immunity, the argument I was making in the court? Well, it would have cut profits of a $100 billion industry in half. Because at that time, 50% of Americans had already been infected with COVID. Now that number, again, is north of 80%. So there's a lot of money at stake. We could do a separate lecture again on the sort of capture of our three-letter agencies by corporate interests, but that would take us too far afield. So the melding of state and corporate power actually constitutes the precise and original definition of fascism as defined by Benito Mussolini. This political system pushes populations in the direction of alienation and depersonalization. And at the risk of sounding sort of alarmist, this regime, I believe, will move in the direction of totalitarianism if we don't put the brakes on, if we don't have some legal and policy and sort of cultural reforms to get a handle on this. The origin of lockdowns, the first country to lock down was what? It was Wuhan, China, right? The Chinese Communist Party claimed that they had stamped out COVID cases in that region by these draconian lockdowns. Italy followed suit. The United States followed Italy. The rest of the countries fell like dominoes shortly thereafter. If you think my worries about totalitarian tendencies are exaggerated, consider the following. 22 countries used surveillance drones to monitor their population for COVID rule breakers. 28 countries used internet censorship, including the United States. 13 countries resorted to internet shutdowns to manage populations. Several countries besides China deployed facial recognition technologies to track down dissenters, people that were moving about publicly during lockdowns. 32 countries deployed militaries or military ordinances to enforce COVID rules, actions which included casualties. In Angola, for example, police shot and killed several citizens while imposing that country's lockdown, all for the sake of their health, of course. Now, the common feature of all totalitarian systems is not concentration camps or secret police or men in jackboots, as horrifying as all of these things are. It's not even mass surveillance, as concerning as all of that is. The common feature of all totalitarian systems, according to the great Eric Voegelin, political theorist who studied the 20th century totalitarians, he said the common feature of all totalitarian systems is the prohibition of questions, the inability to ask certain questions. Some of my tweets that were censored by Twitter were simply questions. They weren't a claim or a statement about public health or public policy. They were questions like, why did way more people die in 2021 of COVID than in 2020, even though we had a vaccine in 2021, but not in 2020? Misinformation, canceled, censored, right? Are these school closures really necessary? Shh. We can't talk about that, right? Do people that have had COVID really need the shh? We can't question the public health authorities on these matters. When we can't ask questions, we're heading for deep trouble. I recently joined as a plaintiff in a case. The Attorney General of Missouri and Louisiana are filing a lawsuit against the Biden administration for alleged collusion between the Biden administration and the big tech companies to censor and control and stamp out any dissidents who challenge COVID public health policy that's being recommended by the administration. And ostensibly private social media companies, this is a complex legal argument, but you can make the argument that these private companies can censor. But there's absolutely no doubt that these private companies cannot become the long arm of the government to do the government's bidding, which is precisely what happened during COVID. Some of you might remember the Freedom Convoy, the truckers' convoy in Canada that happened last year. There was a similar convoy that formed here. But the Canadian convoy drove to Ottawa, the capital city, and sort of parked there for an extended stay, several weeks, to protest some of the more authoritarian COVID measures. And rather than meeting with these disgruntled citizens, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, just upped the authoritarian ante and invoked, for the first time in Canadian history, the Emergency Act. And under the Emergency Act, he sent in police to forcibly remove the truckers from the city. perhaps even more concerningly, under the Emergency Act, Trudeau, without a court order, froze the bank accounts of the protesters and froze the bank accounts even of people who had given money to the protests. So imagine giving $50 to the truckers one day and going to the ATM the next day, and you can't withdraw money from your checking or savings account because the government just ordered the banks, and the banks, amazingly, rather than defending their customers, the banks in Canada willingly complied. Our general goodwill and civic mindedness, which I think was apparent during the pandemic. All of us wanted to do the right thing. Nobody wanted to kill grandma. All of us were trying to take COVID seriously and do what we could to address this emergency. And this was a serious virus for those who are vulnerable, particularly the elderly. I don't want to minimize that. I have treated countless patients who died of COVID and consulted on many of those cases in the hospital. So I've seen what this virus can do. But our general goodwill and civic mindedness, I think, eventually became an excuse for misplaced trust, or even a kind of self-protective timidity during the pandemic. I think it's what I've described here, and there's more. We could dive deeper into the rabbit hole, but at least this hopefully gives you a taste of the direction that things may move in if we don't sort of wake up and realize what's coming. There will be another public health emergency declared soon, whether it's for a virus or a computer virus or any number of things. And so I think it's not too early for us to heed the warning of the great Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who said in the Gulag Archipelago, quote, "If only we had stood together against the common threat, we could have easily defeated it. So why didn't we? We didn't love freedom enough. We hurried to submit. We submitted with pleasure." Then he says, and this is a little harsh, but remember, he lived in the Gulag he said, "We purely and simply deserved everything that happened afterwards." It's quite an indictment of a society that was too compliant and was refusing to ask hard questions about what was proceeding and what was being done to them. So COVID seems more or less in the rearview mirror, and we're all sort of breathing a sigh of relief. But I worry that we're still living in a kind of twilight moment. I worry that the hour is later than we think in terms of the implementation of things that 3 years ago would have sounded insane. I mean, the idea of a vaccine passport, right? I have to show a QR code to get on a plane, get on a train, go to a restaurant, get back into my own country. That, you know, this marker that demonstrates that I've done what I have been ordered to do by the government, including injecting a novel substance into my body. You know, this is something that after a year of the sort of psychological abuse of lockdowns, we were willing to do anything to get back to normal. And in the process of that, I worry that we gave up rights that, again, I mean, the bombing of London during World War II, they never went into lockdown. There were curfews, but you know, German bombs were raining down from the sky. This was a serious public health emergency, among other things, right? But they never took the kinds of measures that we took during COVID. Every good faith act of compliance on the part of citizens during the pandemic only resulted in more draconian and more illogical pandemic countermeasures that further eroded our civil liberties, harmed our health, and undermined our human flourishing. So at the risk of ending on a kind of apocalyptic note, I would suggest to you that the next time this stuff starts rolling out, firm resistance to the point even of civil disobedience would not only be permissible under the circumstances, but even necessary if we're going to prevent this twilight from fading into a long night. So on that happy note, I'm now going to give a shameless plug for my book that I just finished. Will be coming out in October. If you want to read more about this, if this didn't depress you enough and you want to torture yourself more, this is going to make a great Christmas gift. So, you know, late October, that in-law of yours who just didn't get it and is kind of fanatic about masks or whatever. You can torment them with this. So thank you for coming. I know it's late. Everyone's had a lot of wine. You're all tired. I appreciate your attention. Yeah.
Where do you see the possibility of this nightmare of occurring in the abortion issue?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. That's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about this in relation to. So the question was, how do I see this operating, perhaps in the abortion context? I'm thinking on my feet here because I haven't tried to look at the abortion regime through this lens. But I would say, I mean, one of the proposals on the table is, of course, for the states that are permitting abortion, how do we transport people from states with abortion restrictions to states like California and New York that are going to be very permissive? The digital technologies of surveillance and control are not just about extracting data, they're about nudging people in certain directions, right? So certainly part of Planned Parenthood's business model involves sexual education at a very early age, right? And the reason for that is they want future clients, right? Abortion is their moneymaker, and early sexual activity results in more abortions. It sounds cynical to say that, but it's exactly how the business model works. So, I mean, if you've got data gathering mechanisms especially on teenage girls that are tracking their activity and their purchases and their behaviors, that gives you a lot of ways to nudge them in the direction of engaging in the kind of behaviors you want, and then looking for the kind of solutions that you're proposing. So, unwanted pregnancy leading to abortion. I can imagine ways in which, particular vulnerable young people will be targeted as the population's, most demographically likely, based on big data information, to procure an abortion, and have targeted interventions toward those people, trying to induce certain behaviors, and then nudging them toward the local Planned Parenthood clinic and connecting with them, connecting them with resources of people. I mean, the state can know that you're pregnant before you know that you're pregnant once this technology is in place. I'm quite serious about that. If that's the case, then these kinds of technologies and mechanisms can certainly be deployed either by private or governmental agencies, because this data is packaged up and sold to private entities all the time. The National Health Service in Britain was packaging up healthcare data from their city. They have a socialized medicine system. So they were packaging up healthcare data, supposedly de-identified, and selling it to, they were planning to sell it to private companies. When I think it was the Telegraph or somebody broke the story, and then they sort of put it on the back burner for now. But yeah, I mean, the people that can pay for information are going to have access to it, certainly, and that information is useful not only for predictive analytics, but also for nudging, for what advertising has done, for the last 100 years.
They can declare it a health emergency.
Oh,
Everybody
sure.
is entitled to an abortion.
That's already been done. So it was AOC or somebody in Congress was proposing, and Biden was even looking into whether abortion could be declared a public health emergency, and would that give the executive branch any additional powers to facilitate the provision of abortions. So that happened almost immediately after Dobbs. Yeah. Andrew.
So who is pushing back on this? Because it seems like in years past, you'd have everybody from the far right to the left, libertarians, ACLU, basically saying, no way. And it seems like everybody's just kind of getting boiled to death slowly here.
Who's pushing back? I don't know. I think you're looking at him. It's a very small. It's a very small ragtag band of physicians and scientists and researchers and public policy folks that are that have been looking at this. And my book was an attempt to synthesize and formulate a lot of what people are sensing, but put it together in a form that people could draw the dots and the connections and understand it. But what's interesting, in my work in the last 6 months, the people who have come out and supported me are a very diverse political sort of cross-section. I mean, you have some libertarians, the Mises Institute kind of free market folks that don't like all the government interference in market mechanisms and so forth. I have some people, my strongest supporters at the university are people that are slightly left of Mao Zedong. I mean, I have a wonderful medical anthropologist who was an expert witness on my case, and her research is like access to contraceptives for the Bush people of Central America. That's her, whatever, that's her thing. So we disagree on certain issues. But on this, the kind of authoritarian streak that runs through it is very, very concerning to her. And I have other, Foucault scholars and other people on the left who are definitely allies. And then some social conservatives and, Napa Institute type people that were harmed by some of the interventions, or see that their children were harmed by some of the interventions, the school closures, the lockdowns, the mandates, and so forth. So it's a ragtag group. It's very hard to characterize politically. I actually sense political shifts underway. So like this one professor that I mentioned, she calls me up a few months ago. I can't believe I'm watching Tucker Carlson and listening to Alex Jones, like, to try to get, alternative viewpoint on what's going on with COVID, but here I am. So I think there's a lot of politically homeless people now on the left or on, certain sections of the right that are sort of, because of a lot of this stuff, are asking questions that they weren't asking before. And, a lot of progressives that are realizing that the progressive wing of leftism is way more authoritarian than, they imagine. This is sort of not what I signed up for, what I imagined myself to be as a liberal or a leftist. So we're living in interesting times. I don't know how all those realignments are going to shake out politically. But yeah, I mean, right now it's just guerrilla warfare. So yeah, there aren't many of us. So
can our system of federalism act as a braking mechanism?
Well, so it has to. In the last chapter of my book, I talk about some policy reforms. We definitely need reforms regarding the state of exception, the state of emergency. So we need to either define in law some thresholds for what constitutes an emergency that would allow for a judicial review periodically as a check on the executive power, or we need a provision for a very temporary state of emergency. You have an earthquake, and the governor wants to call a state of emergency. You don't have time, for the state legislature to get together and vote on it. Okay, fine. But sometime in the next 2 weeks, the legislature can get together and have do we need to renew this? And then every month or two, kind of reviewing it, so that the executive can't, take total control, assume additional powers, and then just keep going. So either legislative or judicial checks on the system, or both, are necessary. And actually, I don't think this would go over right now, but there is reason to call into question whether law even needs a provision for a state of emergency at all. Like, one thing that we should demand is actual empirical evidence that declaring a state of emergency for a public health issue or a mass disaster, a mass casualty event, actually improves outcomes for that event. And surprisingly, we have zero evidence of that. We have one study that looked at this that showed worse public health outcomes when you declare a state of emergency. And so, I mean, people think kind of intuitively or commonsensically that, yeah, maybe something like this is necessary. Somebody has to sort of take control of the reins. You don't have time for the normal, cumbersome democratic processes when there's a big disaster or when it's wartime or what have you. But we should actually challenge that notion and demand some level of evidence that that is actually the case, and that this actually does improve our ability to deal with a crisis or to deal with an emergency. And right now, we don't have that. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. Just a point of observation, in China, we understand that in reference to what you had talked about the electronic money, et cetera, how that's on their phone, et cetera. Apparently, when students were trying to go to protest regarding the Shanghai closures, they actually shut down the students from being able to board the trains because everything's on their phone, their currency, their IDs, their photometrics. So when they went to the door of the train, it wouldn't open, it wouldn't allow them to proceed. And that's kind of the concern about, you know, the electronic currencies and the biometrics being used. So go back to dumb
exactly
phones,
right.
is that the question?
And the digital yuan, Chinese central bank digital currency, was used during the Beijing Olympics. So it was exported internationally because anyone who went to the Beijing Olympics, including the athletes, had to use that, had to download the app on their phone, and had to do all of their transactions while they were there using this digital currency. So they've shown that they can deploy it not only for their own citizens, but for other people around the world that come and visit. And now that the app is on the phone, it is extracting all kinds of data from those individuals, probably without most of them being aware of it. So yeah, the problem with the pairing of digital IDs, biometric markers, and the central bank digital currencies is once that system is in place, right, if cash is really phased out, and that is the only way to do, I mean, there'll be black markets and so forth, and you can trade chickens with people probably, but if that's the only way to get on in like real civil society, right, once the system is in place, it'll be almost impossible to overthrow, right? Because how do you stage a protest? How do you start your car? How do you know, any dissident can immediately be just turned off entirely from movement, from transactions, from the ability to do anything, the ability to say anything online, the ability to communicate electronically and so forth. So, I mean, these are powers that Stalin and Hitler could only have dreamed of. I mean, their methods of surveillance and control were ridiculously rudimentary compared to the technologies that all these technologies are already available. So I have an epilogue in the book called Seattle 2030 that imagines what the world will look like 8 years from now if this stuff keeps moving forward. And it's a little dystopian, but all of the technologies that I describe in the epilogue are already with us. They just haven't been deployed on a mass scale. So this is not science fiction imagining what might be coming down the pike if we invent the ability to do X, Y, and Z. This is stuff that's already in the works, that has been deployed in some regions, and that many powerful people are fully behind and ready to implement. How are we doing for time? It's getting late. If any of you want to stay and chat, I'm happy to do that. Thank you for coming. I hope you have a good night.